The smell of decay was a quiet poison in the last-page bookstore. It was the scent of forgotten stories, of yellowed paper turning brittle, of a dream slowly surrendering to dust and indifference. Arthur Finch, the proprietor, breathed it in every day until it had become a part of him. He was a stooped, quiet man, his shoulders curved as if under the weight of all the words he had failed to sell. His hands, gnarled with age, trembled slightly as he ran them over the spine of a leather-bound copy of Moby Dick, its gold leaf flaking like dead skin. The bell above the door didn't so much chime as it did clatter, a sound of metallic protest at being disturbed. Two men filled the doorway, their expensive suits a stark, predatory contrast to the gentle disarray of the shop. The taller one, Marcus Thorne, had a smile that never reached his eyes, a polished veneer over a core of cold ambition. The other, a thick-necked brute named Griggs, looked as if he had been chiseled from concrete and malice. Thorne's gaze swept the room with undisguised contempt. "Still here, Arthur? I thought the rats would have carried you off by now." Arthur didn't rise to the bait. He placed the book carefully back on its shelf, his movements deliberate, a small act of defiance against the vulgar haste of the modern world. "The store is open until 5, Mr. Thorne." "Not for much longer," Thorne said, stepping inside. Griggs followed, his heavy boots scuffing the worn floorboards. He stopped by a tall, precarious stack of first editions Arthur had spent the morning arranging. With a lazy, deliberate motion, Griggs brushed against it. The tower of books swayed for a heart-stopping moment before collapsing, a cascade of paper and cardboard that landed with a series of soft, defeated thuds. Pages splayed open, spines cracked. A cloud of dust rose, dancing in the single beam of sunlight cutting through the grimy window. The few customers browsing in the back, a student, a woman in a trench coat, looked up, then quickly looked away, their silence a form of complicity. Thorne merely smirked. Clumsy, Griggs hidden behind a towering shelf of historical biographies. A small face with wide, frightened eyes watched it all. Lily, Arthur's 7-year-old granddaughter, pressed herself deeper into the shadows. She saw the sneer on the developer's face, the casual cruelty in his man's posture. But what broke her heart was the look on her grandfather's face. It wasn't anger or fear. It was a deep, hollow shame, the look of a man being erased from his own life, and he was too tired, too worn down to fight back. She saw him shrink, his already stooped shoulders curling inward just a little more, as if to make himself a smaller target. The world, it seemed, had already decided he was worthless. The conflict, when it came, was not a storm but a quiet, chilling execution. Thorne pulled a folded document from the inner pocket of his jacket, the crispness of the paper an insult in the dusty air. He flattened it on the counter, the sharp snap of the paper echoing in the funereal silence of the bookstore. "Your final notice, Arthur. As per our last discussion, my offer was more than generous. You have 24 hours to vacate the premises. After that, we begin demolition." He tapped a manicured finger on the paper, right next to the bold, unforgiving legal type. The words swam before Arthur's eyes. Eviction. Demolition. Trespass. They were violent words. Words meant to shatter a life built of quiet moments and whispered stories. Arthur reached for the notice, his hand shaking so violently he had to steady it with his other. He didn't read it. He didn't need to. He had read its predecessors a dozen times. This was just the final nail. Outside, the neighborhood watched. Mrs. Gable, who had lived next door for 40 years and used to bring Eleanor, Arthur's late wife, fresh-baked scones, peeked through her lace curtains before quickly drawing them shut. Mr. Henderson, the owner of the bustling cafe across the street, who Arthur had known since he was a boy, turned his back to polish an already gleaming espresso machine. They were not cruel people, but they were practical. Thorne's development promised new life, higher property values, a fresh coat of paint over the street's faded dignity. Arthur's bookstore was a relic, a stubborn pocket of the past holding back the inevitable tide of the future. Their silence was a verdict. Arthur stood clutching the paper, his knuckles white. He didn't raise his voice, didn't plead. His pride, though battered, was all he had left. His entire life had been a testament to enduring, to standing firm when the world pushed. But this felt different. This was an annihilation. Thorn seemed to enjoy the old man's silent capitulation. He straightened his tie, a final gesture of dominance. "This whole street will thank me when this tomb is gone," he said, his voice loud enough for the averted eyes across the street to hear. As he turned to leave, Griggs, with a final act of petty vandalism, shoved a revolving display of paperbacks. It spun wildly, then toppled over, sending hundreds of books skittering across the floor like frightened mice. Lily, still hidden, flinched as if she had been struck. The door clattered shut behind them, leaving Arthur alone in the wreckage of his life, the eviction notice a cold weight in his hand. Kneeling on the floor, his old joints protesting with a chorus of creaks and groans, Arthur began the painstaking process of picking up the scattered books. Each one he touched was a ghost. A collection of poetry by Yeats, its cover worn smooth, was the first gift he had ever given Eleanor. He could almost smell her perfume on its pages, a faint whisper of lavender and vanilla. They had built this store together, plank by plank, shelf by shelf. It was their shared sanctuary, a fortress against a world that was too loud, too fast. After she was gone, it became his only connection to her. Her photograph, faded by years of sunlight, sat on the counter, her smile a beacon in the encroaching gloom. Picking up a thick, dog-eared history of the Korean War, his fingers traced the map on the inside cover. He rarely spoke of his time in the service. It wasn't the kind of war that made for grand stories or victory parades. It was a cold, grim affair of mud and forgotten hills. He hadn't been a hero in the cinematic sense. He had been a sergeant, a man responsible for getting his boys through the night. He learned then that true strength wasn't about shouting orders or charging into the fray. It was about the quiet, unyielding resolve to hold your ground, to protect what was yours, to endure the unendurable. Behind the counter, tucked away in a dusty box, was a small, tarnished Distinguished Service Cross. No one knew about it. He never showed it. The medal wasn't a trophy. It was a reminder of the cost, of the men who hadn't come home. One of them, a young private named O'Malley, had died in his arms, whispering about the girl he was going to marry. Arthur had carried that weight for 50 years. His life now was a quiet one, defined by the rustle of turning pages and the soft footfalls of his granddaughter. Lily was the light that held the shadows at bay. He read to her every night, their heads bent together over tales of dragons and distant galaxies. For her, these books were magic. For him, they were a legacy. They were the collected wisdom and dreams of humanity, and he was their humble keeper. This store wasn't just a business. It was the last bastion of a life of principle, a promise he had made to Eleanor, a duty he felt to the stories themselves. As he stacked the last of the fallen paperbacks, his gaze fell upon the eviction notice still lying on the counter. The fight wasn't just for a building. It was a fight for memory, for dignity, for the very soul of his past. The day bled away in a haze of muted grief. Arthur moved through the aisles like a ghost in his own museum, trying to pack, but his hands felt clumsy and useless. He would pick up a book, open it, and be lost for 10 minutes in a paragraph, a memory, a scent. Each box he taped shut felt like a coffin. The pressure from the outside world was a palpable thing, a heavy silence that pressed in on the thin glass of the storefront. He could feel the eyes of his neighbors, their fleeting glances of pity mixed with a clear, unspoken relief that it was him, not them, in the path of Thorn's bulldozer. The silence was the cruelest part, confirmed his irrelevance. He was a footnote in the story of the street's revitalization, a bit of inconvenient dust to be swept away. Lily watched him from her small stool behind the counter, her coloring book forgotten. She saw the moment the fight finally left him. He had been trying to lift a heavy box of encyclopedias when his back seized. He let the box fall with a heavy thud and sank into his worn armchair, the stuffing peeking out of a tear in the armrest. He didn't sigh. He didn't cry. He just sat, his head in his hands, utterly and completely defeated. The vibrant, warm grandfather who spun tales of brave knights for her had vanished, replaced by a frail old man drowning in the ruins of his life. The sight of his surrender ignited something in Lily. It was a fierce, protective fire that burned away her fear. Her grandpa was a hero. He had told her stories, not of war, but of helping people, of being strong when it was hard. The world had forgotten, but she hadn't. She would not let them break him. Her decision was instant and absolute. She slid off the stool, her movements quiet and purposeful. From her school bag, she pulled a slightly crumpled piece of drawing paper and a red crayon. Her tongue stuck out from the corner of her mouth in concentration as she wrote, her letters large and wobbly. The message was simple, a child's unfiltered plea, distilled to its purest form. My grandpa is a hero, she wrote. They are hurting him. Please help. She didn't sign her name. The message wasn't from her. It was for him. She folded the paper into a small, tight square, her small hands creasing it with fierce determination. Her plan was terrifying, but the image of her grandfather's broken posture was more terrifying still. She had to do something. The silence of the world was deafening, and she was about to answer it with a single, desperate whisper. Slipping out the back door of the bookstore, Lily felt a tremor of fear run through her small frame. The alley was grim, smelling of stale garbage and rain, but she squared her shoulders and walked toward the main street, her small fist clutching the folded note. She knew where she was going. At the end of the block, nestled between a laundromat and a pawn shop, was Sal's Diner. It was a place her grandfather called an institution, with its cracked red vinyl booths and the constant sizzle of burgers on the grill. It was also the place where the motorcycles sometimes gathered. They were loud, scary men, dressed in black leather that creaked when they moved. Their faces were hidden behind thick beards and sunglasses, and their arms were covered in strange, colorful pictures. Her grandfather had always steered her to the other side of the street when they were near, but she remembered something. A few weeks ago, she had seen one of them, a man so large he seemed to block out the sun, stoop down to help Mrs. Gable pick up a bag of oranges that had split open and rolled into the street. He had done it gently, his huge, tattooed hands carefully gathering the fruit, and he had refused the dollar she tried to press into his palm, just nodding before getting back on his bike. That small act of kindness was a seed of hope in her mind. Today, a dozen motorcycles were parked in a gleaming row in front of the diner, a formidable line of chrome and steel. Taking a deep breath, Lily pushed open the heavy glass door. The diner went instantly quiet. The clatter of cutlery stopped. The low murmur of conversation died. Every eye turned to the small girl standing in the doorway, her bright yellow coat a splash of sun in the dim, smoky room. The bikers occupied the largest booth in the back. They were exactly as intimidating as she had imagined. The man at the head of the table was immense, his beard braided with small silver rings. A patch on his leather vest read "Preacher," his eyes, dark and unreadable, fixed on her. For a moment, Lily's courage faltered. Her legs felt like they were made of jelly. But then she thought of her grandfather, sitting alone in his chair, and her resolve hardened. She walked across the checkered floor, each step an act of will. She stopped at their table and, without a word, held out the crumpled note to the man called Preacher. He looked from the note to her face, his expression a blank mask. The silence in the diner was so thick she could feel it pressing on her skin. Slowly, he reached out a hand the size of a dinner plate and took the piece of paper. His men watched, their faces impassive. Preacher unfolded the note. His eyes scanned the childish scrawl. His face remained unchanged, but a muscle in his jaw twitched. He read it once, then a second time. He folded it carefully and tucked it into his vest pocket. He leaned forward, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to come from the center of the earth. Where? It was the only word he spoke. Lily didn't need to answer with words. She raised a trembling arm and pointed down the street, toward the faded sign of the last page. By late afternoon, the humiliation had escalated into a public spectacle. Thorne and Griggs had returned, not waiting for the 24-hour deadline to expire. They brought with them a small, grim-faced crew and a large, rusted dumpster, which they positioned in the alley behind the bookstore. They were making a point. This wasn't just an eviction. It was an erasure. They started with the boxes Arthur had already packed, tossing them into the dumpster with a contemptuous carelessness that made him flinch with every crash. Then Griggs, a cruel smile playing on his lips, began to empty the shelves directly. He grabbed armfuls of books, their pages fluttering like wounded birds, and hurled them into the metal container. The sound of spines cracking, of covers tearing, was a series of small, sharp heartbreaks. Arthur stood by helplessly, a lone, defeated soldier watching the sacking of his city. The commotion drew the neighbors out of their homes. They stood on their porches and sidewalks, a silent, watchful audience. Whispers rippled through the small crowd. "It's a shame," Mrs. Gable murmured to the man next to her. "Such a lovely little shop," the man, Mr. Henderson from the cafe, just shook his head. "Progress, I suppose. Nothing you can do." Their pity was passive, a sterile emotion that offered no comfort and demanded no action. They watched the destruction of Arthur's life as if it were a television show, a brief, sad drama to be observed before they returned to their own lives. Then, a new sound intruded, a sound that did not belong on their quiet street. It began as a low, deep thrumming, a vibration felt more than heard, resonating up through the soles of their shoes and into their bones. Heads turned. Eyes scanned the street, looking for the source. The sound grew, deepening from a rumble to a roar, a guttural, angry chorus of internal combustion. It wasn't coming from one direction. It was coming from both ends of the street, a pincer movement of sound and fury. The crowd murmured, their passive observation turning to confused alarm. Thorne and his crew paused, looking up from their work, annoyance flashing across their faces. The roar intensified, swelling until it drowned out all other sound, a tidal wave of noise that seemed to shake the very foundations of the buildings. The air grew thick with the smell of gasoline and hot metal. The quiet, indifferent street was about to have its peace violently shattered. The arrival was an invasion. Motorcycles poured into the street from both directions, a torrent of black and chrome that filled the pavement from curb to curb. There were not a dozen. There were dozens upon dozens, a rolling tide of machinery and men that blotted out the asphalt. 50, 100, then more, until a staggering force of 150 bikers had sealed off the block, their engines idling in a deafening, unified symphony of power. They were a legion. Their leather vests or cuts were adorned with the same patch. A stoic, stylized dove with wings of iron. The Iron Doves. They sat astride their machines, a silent, intimidating army. They didn't shout. They didn't rev their engines or make threats. Their sheer presence was the threat. It was a statement of overwhelming, unassailable force that transformed the sleepy residential street into occupied territory. At the head of the formation, directly in front of the alley, was Preacher. He swung a leg over his bike and dismounted, his boots hitting the pavement with a solid, definitive thud. The other bikers cut their engines in a staggered, rolling wave of silence, plunging the street into a sudden, shocking quiet. The only sound was the ticking of cooling metal. Thorne and Griggs were frozen in place, their mouths slightly agape. The workers they had hired took a collective step back, their eyes wide with primal fear. The audience of neighbors stood rooted to the spot, their earlier pity replaced by a mixture of terror and awe. This was something beyond their comprehension. Preacher walked slowly, deliberately, toward the alley. He moved with the unhurried grace of a predator that knows its prey is already trapped. His men, a wall of leather and muscle, dismounted and formed a silent, immovable cordon behind him, blocking any chance of escape. He walked past Thorne as if the developer were nothing more than a piece of street furniture, his eyes fixed on the old man standing beside the dumpster. Arthur looked up, his face a mask of confusion and disbelief. He saw the army of men, the setting sun glinting off the chrome of their machines, and the giant of a man now standing before him, and he could not understand what was happening. The world had tilted on its axis. The silent indifference of his community had been answered by this terrifying, inexplicable display of force. Preacher stopped directly in front of Arthur, his massive frame casting a long shadow over the old man. He ignored the sputtering developer completely, his focus absolute. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet, but it carried with an authority that commanded total attention in the unnaturally silent street. "Arthur Finch?" he asked, the question a confirmation, not an inquiry. Arthur, bewildered and overwhelmed, could only manage a small, shaky nod. Preacher held his gaze for a moment longer, a look of profound, almost solemn respect in his eyes. Then he turned to face his men, who stood at attention like a disciplined military unit. He raised his voice, not shouting, but projecting it with a practiced power that rolled over the assembled crowd of bikers and neighbors. "This man," he declared, his arm gesturing toward Arthur, "is Sergeant Arthur Finch, 3rd Battalion, 2nd Infantry Division." The title, Sergeant, hung in the air, imbued with a weight and dignity that the simple name Arthur had never carried on this street. "He fought in a place most of you have never heard of, in a war this country tries to forget. And in that place he pulled my father out of a burning foxhole after a mortar hit. My father's leg was shattered, and 2 of his squad were gone." Preacher's voice was steady, a recitation of sacred history. "Sergeant Finch threw my father over his shoulder and carried him, and 2 other wounded men, for 2 miles through enemy territory to a medevac point. He saved their lives." A murmur went through the crowd of neighbors. They stared at Arthur, the quiet, stooped man from the failing bookstore, and tried to reconcile that image with the one being painted. A young, heroic soldier performing an act of impossible strength and bravery. Preacher reached inside his own vest and pulled out a worn, leather-bound wallet. From it, he carefully extracted a faded, black-and-white photograph of 2 young soldiers in uniform, their arms slung over each other's shoulders, smiling for the camera. He held it up. "My father, Private O'Malley," he said, tapping the face of one of the men. Then he turned the photo toward Arthur. "He never forgot you, Sergeant. He spent years trying to find you. Before he died, he told me, 'If you ever meet a man named Arthur Finch who is too quiet for his own good and runs a bookstore, you show him the respect he never asked for and never got.' He said you were the best man he ever knew." The reveal landed like a physical blow. The truth, hidden for 50 years, was now laid bare in the middle of the street. Arthur wasn't just a shopkeeper. He was a hero. A forgotten one, perhaps, but a hero nonetheless. And his past had just come roaring back to life on 150 motorcycles. The recognition was immediate and profound. As one, the iron doves began to move. There was no order given, none was needed. They flowed toward the dumpster with a shared, silent purpose. They reached in, their large, tattooed hands moving with surprising delicacy, and began to retrieve the discarded books. They brushed the dirt from the covers, straightened bent pages, and carried them, like rescued artifacts, back into the store. Thorne finally found his voice, a strangled, indignant squawk. "What do you think you're doing? This is my property. I have a legal order. You're all trespassing." Preacher turned to face him, his eyes now stripped of all solemnity, replaced by a gaze as cold and hard as polished granite. "This bookstore," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl, "is now under the protection of the Iron Doves Motorcycle Club, which means it's our property. We're buying it." He nodded to a man built like a refrigerator, who stepped forward and held out a thick, bulging manila envelope. "That's a cash offer for the building, at 20% above your last appraisal. You'll take it." It wasn't a negotiation. It was a command. "And then," Preacher continued, his eyes boring into Thorne, "you and your pet gorilla here are going to get in that dumpster and personally hand out every last book you threw away. You will do it with your own hands." Griggs, incensed, took a step forward, his fists clenching. "You can't." He was cut off as 2 bikers, each one easily his match in size, materialized at his elbows, their presence a silent promise of swift and brutal violence. Griggs paled, the bravado draining from his face. Thorne, a man accustomed to power, found himself utterly powerless. He looked at the sea of hostile faces, the wall of leather-clad muscle, and knew he had no choice. Humiliated, sputtering with impotent rage, he and Griggs climbed into the filthy dumpster. Under the silent, watchful gaze of the bikers and the entire neighborhood, the two men began the demeaning task of passing books to the waiting hands. The sight of their humiliation broke the spell of fear and indifference that had held the neighbors captive. Shamed by their own inaction, they began to move. Mrs. Gable disappeared into her house and emerged moments later with a tray of coffee mugs. Mr. Henderson crossed the street with a platter of sandwiches from his cafe. Others followed, bringing bottles of water, offering to help. A human chain formed, passing the books from the dumpster to a cleaning station and back into the store, a spontaneous act of communal atonement. The street, once divided by silence and judgment, was now united in a mission of restoration. The work continued long after the sun had dipped below the horizon, the scene illuminated by the headlights of the motorcycles, which cast long, dramatic shadows down the alley. The bookstore was transformed. The Iron Doves, it turned out, were not just a force of intimidation. They were a force of creation. They were men who worked with their hands, carpenters, electricians, mechanics. They repaired the broken shelves with a skill that spoke of long practice. They cleaned the grime from the windows until they sparkled. They meticulously re-alphabetized the sections, their gruff voices debating the proper placement of Faulkner versus Fitzgerald. By the time they were finished, the last page was not just restored. It was reborn. It shone with a warmth and vitality it hadn't possessed in decades. Preacher found Arthur inside, standing in the middle of his resurrected dream, his face tracked with tears. In his hand, Preacher held a crisp legal document. "The deed," he said simply, placing it on the counter. "It's yours, free and clear. The club considers it a debt repaid." Arthur tried to speak, to form the words of gratitude that were swelling in his chest, but he was choked with emotion. He could only nod, his throat tight. Preacher then did something that stunned Arthur more than anything else that day. He reached up to his own vest, to the large, intricately stitched patch over his heart that bore the club's insignia. With a small, sharp knife, he carefully cut the threads and removed it. He laid the thick, embroidered patch on the counter beside the deed. "This is for you, Sergeant," he said, his voice thick with a respect that bordered on reverence. "You're one of us now, an Iron Dove. And family doesn't stand alone." Arthur looked at the patch, then at the faces of the bikers who now filled his store, not as invaders but as guardians. He looked at Lily, who had been helping by carefully dusting the children's books, her face beaming with pride. For the first time in years, he did not feel like a relic. He felt seen. As the first light of dawn began to streak the sky, the bikers began to mount their machines. The departure was the reverse of their arrival. Thorne and his crew had long since vanished, their threats and legal papers rendered meaningless. The neighbors had returned to their homes, but the curtains were not drawn. They watched, this time with open respect. The engines came to life not with an angry roar, but with a low, synchronized rumble, a sound of deep and abiding power held in check. They pulled out one by one, a procession of honor guards fading into the morning mist. The final image was of Arthur Finch, standing straight and tall in the warm, inviting light of his bookstore doorway. Lily was beside him, her small hand tucked securely in his. On the counter, next to Eleanor's smiling photograph, lay the Iron Dove's patch, a symbol of a new chapter, a promise that he would never be alone again. The last page was not an ending after all. It was a beginning. The quiet of the street returned, but it was a different kind of quiet now, no longer the silence of indifference, but the silence of respect.